Hello, good evening and welcome. Very pleased to welcome you all to Manchester Metropolitan University, and particularly to that part of it which is the Manchester School of Art, which has supported Design Manchester since it started in 2013. We're now at the beginning of the 5th annual Festival of Design for the City, which is really exciting. Tonight I'm so pleased that we're doing this debate, the 4th of our annual debates about design, in partnership with The Guardian, and so glad to have a few Guardian readers at our debate for a change. I think we've had a few before. But anyway, very happy to have you all here. I have to tell you, housekeeping-wise, that there are no scheduled fire alarms. So if you do hear the fire alarm, you have to make your way quietly and efficiently and quickly, either through these doors down that way or through the back. And I think that's probably all I have to tell you. Did I do it right, Penny? And now I'm very, very pleased to hand over to Rachel Cooper, the chair.
Okay, good evening. Good evening to Manchester, and good evening to the great debate at Design Manchester, the public's realm. Tonight we have three distinguished debaters, speakers. We have Ali Graham, who's Dublin architect, city architect, who actually led the Dublin's bid on World Design Capital, and who also plays a big role in the design strategy for Dublin City. Gary Neville, everybody knows Gary as the Manchester United footballer, who has now gone into property. And we're, I think, aware in Manchester that he's planning to build a new development behind Albert Square. So we're interested to hear his views on architecture and the public's realm. And finally, but not least, Katie Tonkinson, who's a partner in Hawkins Brown Architects, who came to Manchester to develop the Manchester office in 2014, and who is at the moment creating a rooftop garden in the northern quarter. So welcome, everybody. And we're going to go straight ahead to the questions. So I think the first question is Steph Graham. Steph?
I just realised you two have written long answers.
Are rough sleepers a blot on the landscape or a stain on our conscience?
I'm going to turn straight to Gary. What about rough street sleepers then? You actually had something to do with rough street sleepers.
Yeah, this is the most intimidating I've ever been in my life. Yes, I mean, I moved into Manchester city centre for 4 years, from the age of 26 to 30, some 15 years ago. And I would actually say I had a relationship with most of the rough sleepers in the city at that time. There weren't many of them. 99% male, aged between, I would say, 35 and 50. Wrongly, probably now, I would also give them cash. I would go and buy them drinks. My wife would do the same. We would, even if we didn't have anything, go to the cash machine and do that. And as I understood it, you know, there was I won't say minor problem at the time with rough sleepers, but there was, I also got the feeling with these guys that I knew that also, if they wanted to go and actually be in accommodation, they probably could have been as well. There was a feeling around that time in speaking to them. Now I'm in the city every single day. We did the Stock Exchange project 18 months ago. It's completely different. The dynamic's completely different. We had 50 young people in the Stock Exchange. We had 4 girls under the age of 20. We had boys mainly under the age of, I would say, 25. Young people who genuinely had huge issues, and the dynamic has completely changed. Society, obviously, I think it is a stain on society, not the landscape, in respect of what's happening. A lot of the parents don't actually know they're actually on the streets, in my view. If I see a young person, even in the street today or yesterday, I will try and get their phone off them and ring the parents and try and talk them round. And a lot of the parents don't actually know they're on the streets. They believe they've run away from home to go to a partner's house or something like that. It's a complex problem. It cost for 3 to 4 months into the hundreds of thousands to accommodate the rough sleepers in terms of insurance, security, and what we had to go through to get them actually to a point whereby we could be safe as an occupier of a building. It was a building that, to be fair, wasn't fit for purpose. I don't know how we deal with this in terms of one single solution. I genuinely don't. It's terrible. I haven't got the answer. And I don't think one single person has the answer, to be honest with you. I think there needs to be a sort of shared responsibility.
Kate, do you?
I mean, I think, there's been a huge increase in rough sleepers in the city. I think we can all acknowledge that it's escalated dramatically. I think it's a political duty to address homelessness, and I think the policies have lacked consistency really over the last period, which has led to a bit of a proliferation of the problem. It's obviously very emotive, and in my opinion, I think Andy Burnham's recent commentary on it, he's obviously trying to affect a genuine change, but I suppose you do have to wonder if it's going to be enough. He himself is issuing kind of stark warnings about universal credit system, and whether that will kind of actually worsen the situation even more. So I think we talked earlier, didn't we, about a disparity and how you kind of distinguish between the homeless and street beggars, and how we actually can help effectively. So I think Andy Burnham's direction is a good one. As architects on this panel, I suppose we're here to kind of listen and do what we can to help. We take our social responsibility very seriously and make genuine commitments in that area through a number of kind of volunteering, education, schools, and supporting universities, but I'm trying to kind of support people from all backgrounds. But let's hope Andy Burnham can make it.
So what about Dublin?
Yes, it is a very difficult question to answer, and Dublin has a terrible homeless problem, and Ireland has a homeless problem, and it's a structural problem. Yes, we have rough sleepers. There are about 200 rough sleepers in Dublin, but I mean that figure is that's probably completely wrong. I mean, it doesn't include people who are couch surfing. It's just a figure that's taken at regular counts throughout the year. And I did see quite a number of people sleeping or kind of huddled in doorways when I was walking around the city earlier today in Manchester. So obviously it's the same problem, and it's a very rough sleepers. It's a particularly complex problem. There are, and to be honest, I'm not sure it can ever be completely eradicated. So in Dublin, for example, I mean, the pressure on our housing programme is completely intense. And coming up to Christmas, we'll try and find another 200 winter beds in hostels to try and make sure nobody's sleeping rough over winter. But there will still be people who will choose. And I'm not saying that in a cold way. I mean, for reasons, for very profound reasons, they might choose not to go to a hostel. Maybe the hostels aren't good enough. There are all kinds of reasons. I mean, in Ireland, the problem is actually has exacerbated to the point where it's also about homeless families, and we've over 8,000 homeless people in Ireland now, and there are over 1,000 homeless families in Dublin, and 2,500 kids in those families, and they're living in hotels, they're living in emergency accommodation, and the reason they're homeless is by and large because they're unable to afford rent, or they are unable to afford to pay their mortgage. So it's actually a structural problem that goes right to the top of policy, and why we struggle to actually keep pace with this. And when I say struggle, I'm being really honest here. It's actually dictating our entire approach to housing. Might talk about that later. Ultimately, it is about taking decisions at government level about affordability and provision of social homes. I mean, I'm in the camp where I think we should be building far more social homes I'm not as keen on something that was announced was going to be increased in yesterday's Irish government's budget, which is to actually just continue to increase the allowances given to people so that they can rent in the private sector. It's just an ever-decreasing circle.
Can I just mention a couple of specifics around it? I've never really spoken about it, around the homeless project that we did. There were 3 security guards on there 24 hours a day. They obviously did it in rotation. My brother-in-law was on there and his friend, and they were down there every day. The standards inside that building were immaculate, absolutely immaculate. The sense of community in there, because we set some rules. Anybody who fights, anybody who drinks, anybody who does drugs on site, anybody who makes a mess, doesn't clean up, they were out. Not one person had to be kicked out. Over 40 people were placed into homes and into hostels. However, once they went into there and they became lonely again, they were out. It's a community. They actually rely upon that strength of being, and actually in that 3-month, 4-month period, the standards in there that were brilliant. They were actually urging and helping each other to come off. It was spice mainly at the time, very easy to get hold of, and at the time it was legal. They were actually pulling each other off it, and they were being mentored by the security guards and my brother-in-law and his friend. So a mentoring situation, and actually a help, the community spirit was bringing them together and was actually helping them get to a point whereby they're getting more confident, they're getting more belief, they were making better decisions. And that was only over a 3-month period. But the problem is, as soon as you feel as though you've got them into a good place, and then you put them back into what is, to be fair, pretty poor accommodation, they then end up wanting to go back to where they were, and they end up sort of sloping back into. It's just a cycle.
It's a cycle, and I think it actually is to do with designing new ways of dealing with it rather than just actually using the old methods. So I'm going to put it out to the audience. Has anybody got any comments on this, any views, any more questions they'd like to state? Everybody's quite happy with the answers we've given. What about...
I would like to say, I mean, Gary's point is well made. It is about empathy.
It is.
You're not going to be able to change or to actually reach out to everybody, but you'll reach out to a lot of people if you show empathy, which is at the root of all good design decisions.
They require contact time.
Yeah.
And basically, there isn't the support there in the network, the mental health support, to be able to actually give them the one-on-one contact and mentoring they require. That's the fact. The City Council did as much as they could on that project that we had. Ultimately, I think there were only 3 mental health workers in the whole of the city at the time to be able to service everybody, which is just...
And I think that's why the mayor has actually started this homeless fund in order to try and see if we can actually develop more initiatives. So do you think... There's a questioner over there, or somebody who wants to state something. Is the roving mic anywhere? There's somebody here? Oh, there's somebody. We'll start over there then, and we'll come back to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting that you say that once you've excluded the people who are on drugs, the people who are violent, the people who were alcoholics, you had a much better chance of having some kind of community, well-ordered.
Didn't say
I
that.
didn't say
No, he
that.
didn't say that.
Okay.
No, I didn't say that.
But, okay.
They were all on drugs, alcohol, or...
Okay, but you did say that if there was a problem about that they would be excluded.
No, I said there's a standard in the building that we had to maintain for health and safety, insurance purposes. You can't condone criminal activity on your building. There was an empathy from me to actually say you can stay in this building, but I can't condone criminal activity in my building.
Okay.
I think there is a difference. And actually, every one of the 50, if you like, bought into that premise that, there is a standard in here that ultimately we have to stay to. You can't wreck a Grade 2 listed building, you can't smash it up, you can't do drugs on here.
Yeah.
And actually alcohol, to be fair, should be consumed off-site. It was, to be fair, rules that they set. They managed their own pantry, they brought their own food in. It wasn't, I didn't set it personally, but I can't condone criminal activity on my premise, unfortunately.
I'm not criticising that at all, but it's very interesting. I'm from Sheffield, and what the councillors in Sheffield say to us is that there are places for the homeless in hostels and arrangements of one kind or another, but the people who don't feel able to use those are often people for whom alcohol or violence or drugs is an issue, and they're the people who end up on the streets rather than in hospitals.
It's contact and support. That was the one thing that in 4 months we found. Contact and support was the one thing that actually worked. constant help, support, nurturing, love, cuddles, attention, sometimes a bit of criticism, sometimes being strong with them. And the security guards weren't trained. They were just people who understood that these, individuals, young people, were actually vulnerable. They needed help, rather than looking at them and thinking negatively and thinking they were sort of like, say, a blot on the landscape.
Can I add something from a Manchester perspective?
Who is that? Is there somebody? Can you say your name and who?
Yes,
who
my
you
name
are?
is Jenny Cronin. Where I live, we're about to have as neighbours a new development which is part of the Manchester City Council's strategy on homelessness. And it isn't addressing the population that we've just been talking about. The approach is to find the people who are at the earliest possible stages of being homeless. So they are because there is a difference in the culture between those who are at the stages of sofa surfing and those who have got into the street culture. And so one of the big initiatives that the City Council is adopting now, they may have been doing it earlier, but they're putting some emphasis on it in the area where I live, is to find those who are at the very earliest stages and give them somewhere to stay, which is next door to where I live, which is a biggish building with 38
What
beds.
do you feel about that?
Pardon?
How do you feel about that?
I am glad. There are neighbours who are not, but what my neighbours don't seem to realise is that the two buildings that are sort of next door to each other were built, I'm guessing, 60s, 70s, single or two-storey buildings, quite big. But they were designed for different kinds of people with who were very dependent and who had particular special needs. Mostly it had been elderly, but I think it's interesting that now the City Council is using one of those properties, which has become empty recently, for newly homeless adults between over the age of 18, and that project is going to start very soon.
Thank you. There was just one question here, and then we'll finish on that one.
Hello, yes. I'm Dave Ellis, and I'm Chair of Planning for Manchester City Council, but I'm a Labour councillor as well, so I will say something political, because this problem didn't come from nowhere. This comes from underspending on social services. It comes from the whole gamut of public expenditure that the public need to pay and fund through taxation to create a civilised society. And the question was, is this a blot? It's something we should all be ashamed of, because it is, we as a society don't want to live in a society where people have to live in the streets, and it's terrible that it should be the case. But this government, since 2010, have built no new social housing. They've given the local authorities no money to do that. So this is down to, as has been said about Dublin, public expenditure, money on housing, and people moving to cities just like Dublin. Manchester sucks in people from the whole of the north of England, and they end up on the streets. And as we've heard, there are things being done, but it's also about cities, and I hope there's a wider debate about what cities are for, why people move to them, and how they're successful as well, because they bring in people from all over the large areas.
So do you think that Andy Burnham's Mayor's Homeless Fund is the right way to go?
Yes, it brings people together, and it's about all people, and that's what one thing Manchester is good about. We'll talk about things about the response to the bomb and things. Manchester does come together, and people need to pull together all sections of society and work together to try and solve this problem, together with the council, the Greater Manchester Council, Andy Mayor's Greater Manchester Council, Manchester City Council, which has a statutory duty to house homeless people that come to the city, and other areas as well, because people come from all over the north of England, and they come from other boroughs and towns as well, and they end up on the streets of Manchester and London and Birmingham and Leeds. So it's a big issue, this, for every city.
It is a big issue, and I think we're talking about Design Manchester, so I think it's interesting to think about how we might design new ways of looking at it, because as you say, there's a long history to this, and there's all sorts of different policy areas. So I think how we think about it, think in new ways, is going to be a critical
good issue to address tonight in all the discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll move on to the next question, which is, I think, John Owens.
Hi. Obviously, trying to get things back onto design, but the question is, does Manchester have what it takes to be experienced as a world city of design?
Right, okay. Now, somebody who's just come here today, Ali, and had 5 minutes or 10 minutes walking around in the pouring rain, does Manchester have the ability to be a world city of design?
Absolutely. I mean, you've got the most important thing. You've got attitude. So absolutely and when we were talking about this earlier, just about Manchester and City of Design, and it's not just about the built environment. I mean, obviously buildings, and I know I'm an architect, and yet I'm saying that buildings are important, but they're actually not the only important thing, or they're not even the most important thing. It's actually the processes and systems that actually give rise to a good quality built environment. And those processes and systems are all about, I suppose, reconciling competing needs, because everybody's got priorities. One thing I did go to see earlier today was Gary's site, and because I wanted to see the site of this big development, and I also went to see Katie's community development in the Northern Quarter, and it's actually, I mean, cities, that's what's so amazing about cities. They are such a battlefield of competing agendas and priorities, and nobody's wrong and nobody's fully right, and everybody's got a vision. Developers have incredible vision and courage to do what they do, and designers have vision, and communities have vision, except everybody's got a vision for slightly different things. So it's to try and reconcile those competing priorities. And I think ultimately that's what a city of design is, a city that can actually negotiate all of those competing priorities and find and create something that works for everybody and is ultimately civilized. The public realm is I suppose, the focus of the battlefield, because that's where everybody meets. That's where the city council departments meet. That's where the city council meets the citizens. That's where everybody just comes together, and everybody should ultimately be equal. So I suppose the public realm is a reflection of a city's priorities. Manchester, I found, was actually very similar to Dublin in lots of ways. Similar issues. Bit of a hodgepodge. Some things really beautifully done, other things definitely needing doing. Bit of dereliction of key streets. A lot of similarities and probably a lot of shared ambition. But absolutely, Manchester is a city of design.
Right. Kate, you actually brought an office up here for that particular reason, I presume.
We did, yeah.
What's your views on it?
I mean, I think, as you say, we chose to open a studio up in Manchester. There's a hugely strong design community here. Drives the way we think, big slice of the economy in Manchester, and some great educational establishments where we are tonight. I mean, certainly from a built environment perspective, there's a great stable of architects based in the city who put design at the top of their agenda. And I suppose I have great expectations that those architects have the ability and can demonstrate that high design quality and match that with the skill and wit and tenacity to actually deliver it. I think what we need to recognise is we can't do it on our own. So those endeavours need to be matched by aspirations of our clients, by stakeholders, by the city, and for that I think we do need perhaps a clearer city vision. So I think we probably do stand a bit behind other world and European cities. I don't think the kind of world-class discussion, the kind of iconic building discussion is necessarily something that makes for great improvements in design as such. I think at Hawkins Brown we believe in good design, and the world will find it and be influenced accordingly. So I think for me, yes, Manchester deserves to be a world a world city of design, but it needs to, you know, we need to ask for more, and we deserve more, and we should celebrate and build upon the characteristics that make Manchester unique.
Gary, you've lived here a long time. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I just picking up, what would you say makes Manchester unique from a design perspective? If I was, I'm not going to trick you. I'm asking. No, somebody said to me a few weeks ago that, you know, we're talking about the development I was doing. It's not very Manchester, and I said, can you explain to me what Manchester is from a design perspective? I don't know. I genuinely don't. I know the city inside out, but I don't know what it is.
It's about the people. It's about the fabric of the city. So there's, you know, obviously.
I get the culture and the people. But I mean, from a building and architectural perspective, what's its style?
I mean, we don't typically approach our architecture from a stylistic perspective. So I think, I mean, we have a much more kind of human approach. I think we are about making places that have purpose and personality. So I think we start with the people and we consult the people.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective,
That's a great question.
world class. Manchester's made huge improvements in the last 25 years, so I think we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. It has made huge improvements, and the vision of certain people and what it's created has been wonderful. I wouldn't say it's world class. No, I think that would be wrong. I think that you mentioned clients. Ultimately, yeah, clients, city councils have a huge influence. I think the mentality of a lot of clients is the Excel spreadsheet and not design. Is there a mentality of the client in Manchester or the customer that they will pay extra for design, or do they just look at a square foot, 800 square foot apartment, that's the pounds per square foot, versus a building over here, and think, actually, I'm not going to pay 50,000, 20,000 extra because that's a better design building. They'll just look at the reality of location versus size. I'm not sure that people are thinking how generally, and it's a client thing. I genuinely think it's a client thing. The developers ultimately, yes, city council have an influence, but will the customer in this city pay for design? I genuinely believe there is value in design. I genuinely believe that. You might not like what I've designed previously, but I generally will pay extra for what I believe to be good design, or something that's, you know, I feel is good design. I'm not sure that happens. I think the Excel spreadsheet drives a lot of developments.
Ellie, did you say something?
Oh, this is huge.
Is it?
Yeah, well, Gary's question to Katie was very good. What's authentic? So what is authentic? What do you mean about character? Because we have this in Dublin all the time. I mean, the character of the city it's essentially a Georgian city. So it has a particular scale. People say, well, we like the kind of the intimacy of the human scale of Dublin, and that's what tourists come to see, for example. And tourism is very important to the Dublin economy, the Irish economy. So, but ultimately, I think I know it sounds like it's a ducking the question. Yes, it's about an approach. It's about fine grain. You can introduce fine grain in big developments. You can make developments walkable through. So it's not that. So developing in Dublin in a way that is responsive to the context and responsive to the character doesn't mean that we actually just build replica Georgian architecture. No, of course not. But you do have to respect the. I think you draw inspiration from the street pattern. You draw inspiration from scale and context materials, and you interpret it in a modern way. And then you have emerging areas which have the great advantage of actually almost being blank canvases, and you can create completely new architecture, as has happened, say, down in the Docklands and in outlying areas. And then the other point, which Gary opened up, and it's more batted back to him. I mean, as a client, as a developer, do you prize design? Do you pay extra? And anyway, do you not realise that good design doesn't actually cost any more than bad design? In fact, bad design usually costs more than good design.
But you understand that, obviously. I mean, materials, higher quality materials versus lower quality. You'll have sat, I'm sure, in design team meetings where you value engineering, and there's a material that the architect will want to put forward that will be a higher quality of material or a better quality of design, and it will be the first thing that will get chopped because it's not seen to bring value. That's my point I'm making. Not that actually you can't achieve good design out of a sort of a lower cost base. I'm just saying that ultimately when you get to an Excel spreadsheet discussion and the developer wants more profit, they will, of course you'll attack the structure first, the things that you can't see, you'll then attack the M&E potentially, but eventually you're going to get to those that facade material, you're going to get to the interior finishes. You know, it's going to end up being something that's not as true, and that's not in every single situation, but you know, you'll have sat in more design team meetings than I will have done, and the reality of it is there will be a cut on material, quality, design, there will be.
So I was going to ask another question, leading on from this. I mean, does it have to be a world city of design? What do we mean by that anyway? And really, you come back to the aspirations of the city.
I would say that this falls well short, not because I love this city and I will never move from this city. It doesn't accommodate everybody. A family can't live in this city. So to me, straight away, it's got a huge failing. I want to move into this city with my 7 and 8-year-old girls, but the reality of it is the school nearby, is the amenities nearby, the public space, the parks. So straight away you say to yourself, actually, are we a world-class city? Well, no, you can't accommodate families.
So
that's me being brutal and honest, and a city that I absolutely adore and never want to move from. But
so it's about really what the values are and the aspirations for the city and its citizens.
It's a city that's built for young professionals.
I think
my view,
it's not just about, you know, yes, your viability needs to stack up, but it's not materials that I was talking about. It's more about the bigger master plan, and it's about the city actually striving for a better infrastructure. So not just transport infrastructure, social infrastructure, so what you're talking about with schooling, with healthcare, and to make all of that much better connected. And I think that's where it needs to make its
City of a better place to live, that you design it in that way. And maybe, this is another thing, do we think that we have to educate clients, developers and planners in terms of what that should be?
Well, when we were putting together this Dublin bid for World Design Capital, and it was more of a device, it was really just to get a conversation and a focus on design. When we were doing this in 2009, 2010, the economy had collapsed and nobody was going to assign a budget to do research into design and how do you design a better city. But the going after a designation, I suppose people understand that, you know, so they said, fine, go ahead, you have a budget to go after this designation. But ultimately, we just wanted to talk about how to make a better city and what is design, trying to understand, do Irish people actually value design? We came to the conclusion, no, we don't really understand what design is. We don't understand it, really. We think it's about pounds, shillings and pence. It's actually about much more than that. And we had a thematic structure around the bid, which was where we asked the question, how do you make Dublin smile? How do you make Dublin people smile? So how do you make the city more humane and attractive? How do you connect the city? How do you connect systems and services to people in the right way? Like Gary's amazing project for homeless people. How do you make the city flow? So what about the economy of the city? How is that working well? And how do you make the city lighter? How do you respond to climate change? So once you start talking about all these issues, suddenly design is about everything, and design is everywhere. And when I said I think Manchester is a city of design, you're a city of design if you're prepared to talk about the issues, and you're prepared to be honest about them, and you're prepared to actually take a collaborative approach to addressing them, and you're prepared to make tough decisions. That's a city of design. It's not about perfection in a physical sense.
I'd like to open it up to the audience. Has anybody got a view, a question? We've two on the front. So one there and then. Can you say your name? And
been told to stand up. My name's Linda Ralph Knight. There's quite a strong emphasis, and I can understand why, because you've got public realms, utopic, and you've got people in the built environment, active in the built environment on the panel. But the focus has been on the built environment. It's not about buildings. And my background is as a design journalist. And I think it's a bit intangible what makes a world-class design city. But one of the elements is certainly that you attract inspiring, creative people, designers maybe, but creative people, to visit or stay. You have a great education system, which you have here. It's renowned worldwide. It's not just about, I'm not saying it shouldn't be about, but it's not just about providing great homes for families locally. It's actually about setting your store out globally. If you want to be globally acknowledged, it's a bigger thing. I'm not from Manchester. I was born in the north, but I live in London. And it's not there yet, I don't think, but it doesn't mean it couldn't be. Things like Design Manchester are there to attract in those inspiring people. People in this college attract in inspiring people to teach or speak and to be inspired and go back and say what a great time they had here. So I haven't got an answer. I've just gone on a bit about broadening
So it's about attracting people.
It's about broadening the question beyond the built environment.
Yeah, but sometimes do iconic buildings and iconic places attract the designers in and the creative people in? So it's about the relationship between place and...
Yeah, but quite often it's a public building rather than... I think your project's great, Gary, but it's more likely something like a concert hall or a cultural institution.
Yeah.
But yet you could argue we failed miserably with the attempt. It might seem arrogant, might seem ignorant. The aspiration of St Michael's was out of a frustration of living in Manchester in a residential block, and wanted to lift the standard, and actually felt that Manchester should start to have signature buildings that actually, whilst it's not the most critical thing I accept, but it would actually start to put Manchester on the map as being serious about design. Now, I think you could argue we failed miserably, and I don't mind admitting that here. But the intention was there to try and raise the standard to a point whereby it was a building that could capture the imagination of people and actually raise the standard. I don't think we achieved it. Maybe not even achieved it now. It's subjective, but I think you're right. I think a signature building or two, people might argue we've already got them, or we have. Historic buildings, certainly. But modern buildings, is there a building that's been built in the last 20 years that you would argue is outstanding, that's a signature building? I'm not sure. Some people may think there is. Is there?
Is there?
Is there a great building been built in? I mean, I love this building, actually, so it's the first time I've been in it.
We'll move on to the next question. Yeah, just stand up and say your
my
name.
name's Alan Sherwood. I'm from Glasgow and East Kilbride, so mixed architecture there. But I'm interested in the panel's views on how obstructive a council is, or a planning department, in improving the quality of a city, in your experience.
How obstructive am I? Okay, I'm not in the planning department in Dublin City Council. I'm a city architect, and a lot of the focus of our work is housing, but we also work across all city council departments, so we have a pretty broad overview of what goes on. No, I mean, absolutely not. The planning department is not obstructing development. The planning department is trying to balance, always trying to balance competing agendas. We have an interesting situation at the moment where a tall building has been refused permission, and it is being appealed to the board, to our appeals board. And I mean, ultimately, I think if that tall building had been about just a few meters left or right, it would have probably been fine, because our planning department is pro-development and the city council is pro-development in the best sense of the word. But it just happens to be in precisely the wrong spot. So we will have that a discussion I'm sure there'll be an oral hearing for this, and I'm not going to go into our own city architect's report on the issues we had with the building, but the fact, no, I think our planning department is extremely positive and encouraging, but it does have to reconcile competing agendas: conservation agenda, the economic agenda, the community reservations. Has to do all that.
Anybody else on the panel?
I would say Manchester is bold.
Yeah.
I would say it's bold. I think the council is bold around development. I generally would. It's my impression.
I would agree. Yeah, they're supportive of big
So
visions.
no, in Manchester it's not. I have to say there are other probably cities where there aren't as many well-qualified planners who are able to make interesting decisions, but that's another point we can talk about. Anyway, I think we should move on to the next question, which actually is Linda Rolfe-Knight. So, Linda.
Thank you. As I just said, I'm not from round here. Well, I was born round here, but I'm not from round here, and therefore this question might not be directly relevant to Manchester, but it's one that the whole of the UK is looking at the moment. It's, should high-rise be abandoned in the wake of Grenfell Tower, given the housing situation?
What about Kate?
Okay.
You're an architect in Manchester.
High-rise building.
High-rise?
No, it need not, should not be abandoned. I think, you know, it's obvious that there needs to be a step change in the regulations. You might say, you know, the regulations are woefully out of date. How are we where we are? Again, it's a tricky political one. I think if we take all of the kind of improvements to those regulations, fire suppression and lift evacuation and what have you, as an essential first step, and subject to working with the right experts in fire safety and so on, then I believe we should absolutely still promote tall buildings when they're sited appropriately, be it as part of a cluster or as a marker for new pieces of public realm or with civic offers, and also when they're designed to a high standard. So I think we need to recognise that tall buildings give us the opportunity to deliver a lot of homes in a small amount of space, and that high density living is a good thing, subject to all the necessary infrastructure to support it. And you know, we often bring forward master plans that include high-rise buildings, but also medium-scale buildings and lower-rise family homes. So I think tall residential buildings enliven our city centres. They create an alternative to suburbia, so they should not be thrown away. No.
Absolutely shouldn't be thrown away. Not yet, anyway. No, definitely not. I think 2 points I want to make on tall buildings. But coming back to the point before around value engineering and designing out, embarrassingly and wrongly, it's also a potential area of attack for the QS, for the developer, to say we don't want sprinklers because it costs too much money, we don't want secondary means of escape, we don't want to go the extra mile on fire safety because we just want to do the minimum, which is the regulations. That's number one, believe it or not, that's reality. Secondly, specific to St Michael's development in the last 3 months, the two hotel operators that we're speaking to are American based. I can't tell you that, but they're American based. They have said that they will not, and we've had to design it in now, we've added extra means of escapes into our building to meet American standards, which actually are far more than what we need to do in this country, or else they won't operate the hotels. So we're actually now having to, use the right word, incur the extra cost of the extra staircase that wouldn't normally be needed in this country, because the operators that we do want to come and actually operate our building will not operate them without that extra means of escape. So it's interesting that there's two live examples there from my point of view. Historically, you'll have sat in design team meetings when you're over budget and you'll look at things like fire, facade, design. You'll also look at things like, but actually specific experiences that I think operators of buildings and the regulations do need stepping up, and they are a lot higher in other countries.
And it relates to the fact that a lot of the taller buildings in social housing do a lot of that cutting, I imagine.
Inevitably, because it happens on commercial development, so it's going to happen on every development, I would think.
No. It's about construction quality. Ultimately, fire safety is completely determined on the contractor making the right connections, to fire sealing, etc. We've had problems with buildings in Ireland because they've one particular development called Priory Hall had to be effectively, which was a private apartment development. Everybody ended up having to be moved out. It was incredibly, it was a profoundly horrendous experience for the people who lived in these apartments. And we had to, the City Council had to take over the development and effectively rebuild it. So it is about actually construction standards and training and obviously not, obviously fire safety is paramount and should never be cut. The experiences with the fire safety in buildings, and Priory Hall was not a tall building. The experiences with fire safety have actually caused a complete overhaul of our own building regulations and a complete change to how we certify buildings.
There is a challenge, and ask the design people on this panel around historic buildings and how they meet regulation without actually destroying the fabric. There are challenges sometimes. In terms of, like I say,
and I think there's
the challenge.
There's challenges to design now in terms of building people's confidence in terms of high-rise. You know, I mean, you're going to be building some high-rise. Obviously, some of it's residential. So, you know, doing the introducing the design features that you're going to is obviously going to enable you to give people confidence.
Yeah, I mean, we were using Make architects from London, Stephen Hodder, Manchester-based, both prominent architects who designed a level that they believe was satisfactory. We've been driven to actually increase that standard by an operator, hotel operator. So actually, they're not doing anything wrong, the architects. When I say they're just meeting the regulations, they're doing their job.
So maybe actually architects need to go beyond their job sometimes. Would you say?
Good luck.
Well, we need help. With the regulations.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, I think they are woefully behind, but they've been sat on.
So we need policymakers to come back and look at regulations so that both the developers and the architects actually think a bit more carefully about it and build confidence in communities. Any views in the audience? And is there one at the back or just in there? Name?
Hello, my name's David Donegal. A few weeks ago I actually went to Grenfell, and it's almost unbearable to even actually look at that shell that just resembles a tombstone now sticking up out of the London street. But one of the biggest criticisms against high-rise living, especially when they were built as social housing in the 1960s and 70s, was the social isolation they promoted, because they become in effect kind of multi-storey gated communities where there's no kind of street life, where people don't mix. And at the time in Manchester, when they were doing the slum clearances in Hume and things and replacing them with high rises and deck access buildings, a lot of the people who were moving in thought they were great because, you know, they had high standards, they had indoor bathrooms and toilets and things like that. So they were a big improvement on what they were leaving. But even very early on, people were recognising that they were losing the neighbourliness and the interaction with other people. And I think what we're building now with these high-rise residential blocks in particular, in some ways, you've talked about the fire standards and things being much higher, but in a lot of ways the standards of those buildings are a lot less than the council buildings. They're much smaller. They don't have the same requirement for, like, say, multiple toilets and things what were introduced at the end of the Second World War in the housing regulations.
So have you got a question for the panel?
Well, I've got a point for the panel, which is about the public realm. Is a lot of these high-rise residential buildings that are being built now also take up all the streets, and the streets are no longer owned by the city council to become private realms and become gated. And typically at the bottom of these buildings, when they're building residential units, there's always other retail opportunities at the bottom, so they become shops and bars, and people have to pay to actually go there. So you're kind of not only privatising and taking away the public space, you're making it that people have to pay to actually be in that space. And if they're not spending money, they're seen as suspect in some way. and the private security guards push him away. And I think one of the things in Manchester is the biggest problem in Manchester is that most people who live in Manchester would argue are very poor and have great
Public
social
realm.
deprivation.
Yeah.
And that's not what you see in the kind of advertising side that's put across the people.
Okay, I think actually we've got a question from Gary. We've got a question that actually leads straight into that discussion. So do you want to ask your
Hi,
question?
Gary McLarnon. My question is, how public is the public realm?
So I think we'll start with Gary on that one. How public is the public realm?
Generally, they are managed and operated spaces. I've not seen people removed in these spaces. So, for instance, if you were to be in spinning fields, I've not seen people shifted on. I mean, obviously, if you're in one of the outlets that's there, but I've not seen people shifted on if they're sat around in the spaces. I mean, I think that's, to me, if you said to me what is Manchester's biggest challenge from a design perspective, it is public space, green space. I'll come back to family space. You know, the idea that we're just short of it. We just haven't got any. And I suppose on St Michael's, the principle of the two towers came from actually building on the minimum part of the site and leaving the maximum amount of the site as open space. It made it a more challenging development. It made it a more costly development. Doing the development we're building now is less expensive. It was actually a more expensive way to do it because I always felt that our duty was to try and give as much space back as open space, and it was huge, the open spaces that we created. We've now lost that in the new design. We've got, I think, a public square that's similar size to Lincoln Square and a sort of thoroughfare. What we've done is transfer it up onto the roof. So the public square now is on the roof, but you're right, it will have to be operated and managed. It will be 20,000 square foot up in the sky. Whether there is something we can do moving forwards to move Manchester's public realm up onto the top of buildings rather than having it at ground level because we haven't got any space. I don't know if that's something that could happen, that maybe the council, in giving planning permissions in the future, could say, actually, we want your roof and it will be a public space. But then how do you get people up there? How do you get people down? It's challenges, it's difficult. You have to operate it and manage it in some ways from a health and safety perspective. So all these questions, it's not easy. It's not easy.
Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot of stuff in the press at the minute about POPs, isn't there? So the privately managed or pseudo-public space, I think. And I think, you know, some of that's quite alarming to sort of discover at first, but I think, you know, there are good reasons quite often for why some of those spaces are governed or managed. I think perhaps it's just about giving people greater clarity and a kind of openness and a transparency about what those spaces are. And whether they are truly public or private. I think in London the mayor's kind of pledging to make better accessibility and try and restrict the kind of any minimise restrictions in those spaces and try and impose conditions at kind of a planning stage. But I think we need to think about the kind of lifetime of those spaces, and I think, you know, in terms of public realm in Manchester, you know, start with the streets. It's, you know, the public realm is not just about squares and parks, obviously important, but also about everything from kind of the pavement to the canal towpath. So I think, you know, that should be, we should be thinking about those critical pieces of public realm too.
We haven't quite gone down the road in Dublin yet of POPs, privately operated public spaces. There's I think a lot less in Dublin than I gather is in London, and I have to say there is an appeal of say, and I saw the King's Cross development, for example, a few months ago, and you just saw this pristine public space, and, you know, immaculately, you know, clearly well managed, everybody behaving themselves, and then you contrast it with the rough and tumble of many of, you know, the absolutely public streets. And for example, we had there was a bit of a brouhaha a few weeks ago, a journalist in Dublin decided to write a very long and critical article about what we call the boardwalk along the River Liffey, and the incredible, as she maintained, an incredible amount of antisocial activity. And that's just, I gave her a response, and I just said, look, I don't agree that there's an incredible amount of antisocial activity. Antisocial activity is a policing matter, and isn't it a good thing that it is a public space rather than Dublin just going down the road of giving all our public spaces over to private operators to manage? So I think what we've done is good. I think the question was connected to tall buildings. Do they generate good quality public spaces? Well, obviously they do have an environmental impact in that. I certainly did feel, it might have been just coincidence when I was walking around today in the rain, that things got a lot windier and my umbrella didn't function when I was close to tall buildings. And I did say to Gary earlier that tall buildings, they can be a bit of a distraction. The real experience of the building is what people are experiencing at street level, and it's that lower block around the tall building that pays for the tall building effectively. That's the one that is it's really important to get it right. It's important that it's permeable. I might mention later, if there's time, a project we just did with a retail group in Dublin city centre, the Business Improvement District. It was a collaboration with the American Institute of Architects, where the Business Improvement District team came to us and said, we have a problem with commercial, maybe not as thriving commercial activity in a certain part of the city. And we reckon it's because of the quality of the public realm and the lack of permeability, as in the routes through. The city blocks are too big, they're too massive, and come 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, they shut down and you can't get through. Whereas the other side of the city, when you look at the map, you see it's much more permeable, and you see people are moving around all of the streets, whereas on the northern side of the city, people are moving down one particular street en masse, and they're not moving down the other streets. So so businesses on the other streets are struggling more. So permeability is actually what's at issue, and the quality of the experience at street level. And it's not rocket science. There are actually clearly defined rules trotted out for how you actually make animated streets, and I just think people, sometimes we just forget them in the rush to develop.
Yeah, on the first St Michael's scheme, we created a lot of public space within the development, but really got it badly wrong in terms of street activation around Jackson's Row and Bootle Street. We talked about connectivity. We talked about the fact that you could connect Albert Square through into Spinning Fields through these two streets, very underused streets that suffer, the poor streets actually. You wouldn't choose to walk down them, the back streets really. A lot of dustbins, a lot of sort of ramps and entrances to buildings on Peter Street. However, now, in the sort of addressing the sort of wrongs of what happened in the first scheme, I would say now probably 85-90% of the, well, for a start, the Bootle Street Police Station facade stays, so that's there, the pub stays, and actually there is activation now 85-90% around, and there is actually genuine connectivity, not just down Bootle Street and Jackson Road, but across the site, which we didn't have before either. You had to walk up the steps and then back down the other side, which is just ridiculous. So I think that ultimately we've learnt our lesson in terms of, and it was something that Historic England in the sessions that we had with them made us aware of, and Stephen's done a far better job than we did first time round in respect of that.
So coming back to this, the title of this debate, the public's realm, do you think the fact that the response to that first design development actually helped you see where you'd got it wrong and where you could improve on it?
In certain aspects, a little bit of me still cries inside about the loss of the actual open space through. I don't think we got the principle right first time. I think we got the design wrong. Sorry, I don't think we got the principle wrong. We got the design wrong.
Yeah.
I think the principle of actually only building on 50% of that site was the right principle. There were huge, vast spaces. I think bigger than Albert Square when you put them both together. You're talking a huge opportunity here to create something special. And it's lost now because of the fact we got the design wrong.
Yeah. The planner wanted to talk again.
I'm Dave Ellison. I'm a local councillor. I'm not a planner, actually.
sorry.
I'm an architect by profession. It happens to be chair of the planning committee, and that's what councillors do. So it's a member of the public, chairs a planning committee. But in terms of open space in Manchester and the public realm, it's not perfect, and I think, but there are big changes happening in the city. So you've got the new St Peter's Square with a cross-city metro link. That's bringing lots of people into the city, and the city has been very successful over recent years. The population's gone up by 50, 60,000, the footfall in the city's increased, and that's despite a lot of the issues that we've talked about earlier. So there are great spaces. There's a northern quarter, Stevenson Square. There's a whole area around there that's a totally different.
So what do you think about Piccadilly Gardens?
Piccadilly Gardens is about to be redone. So one of the reasons is it's a city square and it was covered in grass. And there's too many people walk over grass. It's not really an urban fabric in a way. And so it needs thinking about.
Yeah, it does, because what about the need for more green space in the city?
Absolutely. Now in Dublin, you've got Stephen's Green, which is, and the green space is right in the middle of Dublin.
Railed. Stephen's Green is a railed.
But
and it's actually a privately operated public space.
There's gardens that I've been to when I've been to Dublin and wandered about to get away from the traffic and the noise. So how do you create that in Manchester is a very good question, and there is a need for more green spaces and a bigger green park, probably on the edge of the city centre of Manchester, but there is a need for it.
Yeah. And if you look at actually some parts of London, there are lots of green spaces, but they're railed.
I lived in Valencia, not very long, but I did live in Valencia. They've drained the riverbed because they were having problems with flooding. It's quite possibly the most outstanding public space that I've ever seen. It wraps around the entire city. If any of you have been, it's amazing. And I actually mentioned that at MIPIM last year, and the headline came out that I wanted to drain the but actually I think we need to intervene. I think we need to intervene and do something that's we have to disrupt what's happening. I think it's not just going to happen by individual developers. It has to be a collective sort of, how do we get this green space, this amazing public space?
How do we get that more vision for that sort of thing in the city? I've got a question there, and then we're going to go on to the next question after that. So the person at the end of the row there.
Hi, my name's Missy Fisher. It's not actually a question, it's an observation on Manchester. I don't live in Manchester, I live about 20 minutes away, but Manchester is my home city. I've been coming here since I was a child, brought by my parents, and I've seen massive changes in Manchester. And I think we're being a little bit negative tonight and a little bit harsh on Manchester, because I've seen so many changes, and I think it's developing into a tremendous space. Changes don't happen overnight, we all know that. But we've got some fantastic developments. You only have to go to Ancoats to see how they're celebrating the lovely factories. A lot of them are being made into apartment blocks, but they have a wonderful artworks centred in Ancoats, and that is the sort of thing that I think should be developed further in Manchester itself. It's not just about green spaces or open spaces. It's about appealing to everybody, celebrating the architecture we already have. We've got great bridges in Manchester. There are a lot of old ones. There's some tremendous new ones that are built. And the nice way to make yourself acquainted with a city is to actually walk around it. Now, not walk around it with your eyes shut. I'm actually a practicing artist, and they always say that you shouldn't just look ahead. You should look up, you should look down, and you should look behind you. And I would like to see us being more positive about what I'm hearing tonight, because I think we're heading in the right direction. And there are always people who will want green spaces. Somebody said that they thought that Manchester was just for professional people. I also don't think that's true. Again, just going to Ancoats, they're building what's called Little Venice. There is new housing there. When I come into Manchester, I don't come on the train, I come down Princess Parkway, round where Manchester City's ex-football ground used to be. They're building some great housing around there. It's tremendously coloured. I'd like to live in one of those.
I actually don't think as a panel we've been actually criticising Manchester. I think we've all been saying Manchester's great, but how can we make it even better?
I agree with
so
that.
I think
it sounded a little bit negative rather than positive.
What do we think on the panel?
Thank you.
I think it's called the debate. I mean, I think we're. You can. I suppose if you were listening to our answers, you could suggest that we're picking on potential things that we could improve. But I think, I adore the city. I love it. I would never move from the city. It's my life. So I'm delighted with it. The last 25 years, it's just changed immeasurably. I would completely agree with you. But I suppose we're talking about here the questions that are there, that are in front of us.
Yeah. I think we just, we have high aspirations. So there are great things happening. It's an amazing city, but we want better and we want more. And I think that's as designers, we just kind of embrace that and just strive for more.
An outsider.
No, I don't think the tone is negative at all. I think it's constructive. It's a constructive debate. Manchester's growing, Dublin's growing. We've got to manage the growth. We can't just, ignore it. And the only way it's going to be managed so that everybody wins is if we think about these things and talk about these things and figure out how to do it better. And as Katie says, we want
it's
better.
A design debate, and designers always tend to want to make things better. So I think that's what we're doing. I think we've got time for one more question from Martin Evans, and this rolls on. It's sort of a similar theme, but it's interesting.
Do our public spaces cater for all types of users?
So, do our public spaces cater for all types of users? So, are they accessible? We have lots of young people in the city, we have lots of professionals, but are they accessible for the increasingly aged population that we understand are going to come into cities? For those people who might have various disabilities they're having to cope with, do the cities actually support that?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure of that. I genuinely don't know. I think I'll let others out. What I would say is that the work that's been done, for instance, around the markets, say, for instance, at Christmas, they're a huge success. I'd call Manchester now. It has festivals, it has markets, it has events. I wish they didn't end. I wish they didn't end. I wish the markets didn't end, because ultimately the atmosphere in the city is absolutely electric. When there are events on, it's electric. When you have the sort of summer concerts in Castlefield Bowl, it's absolutely amazing. My personal view would be, could we try and create an events or market or festival programme that actually is all year round and become our identity, because I think we're good at it. And my personal view would be that we should focus on that in respect of creating an identity of our public spaces. So the idea of stretching the markets into flowers in April, wine in
Tulips in May.
And arts and crafts in another month, and just literally rolling from one festival and market to another in each individual public space, and creating that. It disappoints me sometimes when I come in on a Sunday or a Monday and it's at night time and it's not as lively as I think it could be, because you come here in December and it's absolutely all every day of the week. So my personal view would be, let's build on what's already been achieved with respect to the festivals, the markets, the events, the concerts, and actually try and fill the calendar so it's 365 days a year, so it's vibrant all the time. That would be my view on sort of public space in terms of catering for all.
Kate,
is this our last question?
Yeah.
Okay. So where were we again? Types of users.
Yeah.
Different
So
types of users.
does it cater for all ranges, ages, abilities, disabilities? And how do we design a place for the future? Bearing in mind we've got all sorts of technologies coming.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's looking to the future. I think quite often we're guilty of dealing with the here and now, and I think actually as architects at Hawkins Brown, we like to plan for the future. I think it's sort of standard practice for us to kind of be as inclusive as possible with our designs. I think trying to balance sometimes the needs of different user groups can be obviously quite difficult. People with visual impairments and physical impairments, maybe have very different requirements. So I think that can be quite difficult. Different users, I suppose, we try to engage the community as much as we can and do that through kind of early early sort of consultation and engagement. I think one of the latest questions was going to talk about cycling and walking, and I think if we could touch on that now, that might be quite good. So I think from my point of view, to kind of make the city and public spaces cater for all types of users, we should be starting to think of eliminating the car in the city centre and driving towards that, really.
Imagine Manchester, no car Manchester in the city centre.
I think so.
Yeah. So we have to sort of start thinking about these alternative ways of living. I mean, I was going to ask about the fact that you talked earlier, Gary, about bringing families into the city and more families living here. And I think, do you think that sometimes people perceive, who live in the suburbs, coming into Manchester at night, or even in the daytime sometimes, they're put off by what we might consider the drinking culture, the nighttime culture?
Yeah, it's not a city that caters for families to live. You would work here, you would go out here, you would visit here, but
and
you wouldn't.
The festivals sometimes bring the families in.
Yeah, the festivals, the activities bring the families in. I think ultimately that, I would say build on the identity that we're creating around festivals and markets and create that identity and be good at one thing, and that will then drive people in.
I mean, I think that the Manchester International Festival is obviously an amazing festival, and we're big supporters of
and
that.
The design festival
and I think Manchester. I think that the thing that is a shame is probably the kind of the fact that it has become a drinking city, and the kind of levels of drinking and drunkenness are in my view tolerated too much, and I think.
So how do we deal with that in Dublin?
Well, I live with my family and kids. We've lived in the city centre in Dublin for over 20 years now. We actually bucked the trend. We moved into the city rather than even further out when we moved house about 20 years ago. And it is it can be challenging. I'm not going to deny it, but there are also huge. It's also wonderful, and we have lots of lovely neighbours, and lots of families live nearby. Even though people say, "Oh, city centre isn't a place where families can live," actually there are lots of families living in city centres. I'm sure there are lots of families living in Manchester city centre and certainly in Dublin, but. So safety about these families, yes, it does put the fear of God into me when the kids, now young adults, go out, and you kind of just think, hope you're safe. I think the perception and the reality are different. Dublin is actually quite a safe city. I don't know about Manchester, but the one thing we've done, which has been an extraordinary success. It wasn't the city council's doing. It just was almost an organic movement. But it's Gary's point about festivals. There's an event called Culture Night. It's on in September, and it's now spread throughout the country. But it started in Dublin. And on Culture Night, it happens on a Friday. The city centre is taken over by families. They just come in their hordes, and it's at night time, and it's just the city. The city becomes like this great big box of wonderful things, and people go, and all the galleries are open, the restaurants are open, and the city changes from being a city that maybe there's too much of a drinking culture to one which is just overrun with families enjoying the city. So absolutely, I think an earlier comment, we need to intervene and promote better coexistence because this is again a huge topic. I mean, the thing about accessibility and is our public spaces designed for everybody? Yeah, it's a tricky one. I was actually really I was struck by your square outside your public library, which is a wonderful building, and all the tram lines cutting across each other, and it's a very fine square, and the paving is beautiful. And there is no markings on the I don't know if this is controversial, but there is no
shared space, as it were.
It's very much a shared space, and there's no markings. And I presume it's a huge success. We're trying to bring in develop a new public square in the middle of Dublin, College Green. It's hitting on all of these points. What about cyclists? Should cyclists have a dedicated cycle path? Will they run over the thousands of pedestrians who are going to be using this space? What about the visually impaired? Do we not have to cover the thing with markings to make sure everybody's safe? What about the cars? Do they really have to be eliminated? You know, not allowed drive through here. The city's going to grind to a halt. It's like a flashpoint for every single issue that people have. We do have to make spaces usable for everybody. The population is aging. We need to encourage older people in particular to actually live in city centres. And yes, we need to make the streets safe for everybody.
Thank you very much. And I think we can end that now. So I think design isn't just about the architecture and the buildings and the infrastructure. Cities are about people and design is about people. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you very, very much, Rachel. Thank you all, panel. I'd just like to say that immediately after this, we'll all invite you to share a few drinks with us outside. So thank you very much again.
For the questions, thank you for the response.